You're listening to Maximum Medicine Radio with host Doc Martin. Stay tuned in or call in. You won't want to miss what's happening next. How do you step into your maximum potential? How do you connect your spiritual drive with your physical path? Stick around as Doc Martin takes listeners on a journey through the seen and unseen, the accepted and the unbelievable. Get ready to meet the maximum you the world needs on Maximum Medicine Radio with Doc Martin now. Hi, everybody. I'm Doc Martin, Maximum Medicine. So today we have a special guest with us. We have Peter Coyote. So you may remember Peter for all of his work in movies. We have E.T., Bitter Moon. The list goes on and on. You may also remember him from narrating Ken Burns' documentaries. So he received an Emmy for the work on the Pacific Century and also for the Roosevelts. So you might know all of that, but what you might not know and why he's here today is that he's also an author of many books. And the one we're going to talk about today is Zen in the Vernacular. Peter is a longtime Buddhist practitioner. And back in, I think this is accurate, 2011, his teacher ordained him to allow him to be a Buddhist priest and subsequently, therefore, to give transmissions to up-and-coming other Buddhist practitioners. You know, Peter, that's kind of like Leonard Cohen's story. But anyway, that's a whole different world to talk about.
Well, there's one thing that's a little off. In 2011, I was ordained a priest. And then in 2015, I was transmitted. And that's what allows me to operate independently of my teacher. And then I took a vow to remain silent, not to teach for 5 years. And it so happened that that vow ended in 2020 when the pandemic was beginning. And people were kind of clamoring for some kind of succor and relief from anxiety. So I started doing Dharma talks on Facebook at that time.
Wonderful. So how could listeners find you on Facebook and follow when you are giving talks?
The best place is to go to YouTube and look up Hosho, which is my Buddhist name, Hosho, Hosho Peter Coyote. Even if you just search Peter Coyote, you'll find a lot of stuff and many of my Dharma talks. But if you just want to concentrate on the Dharma talks, go to Hosho Peter Coyote. That's my channel on YouTube.
What does Hosho mean?
Hosho means Dharma voice. You have every Buddhist priest, or I guess actually it begins when you take vows, you're given a Buddhist name. It's usually 4 syllables. So Hosho, my name is Hosho Jishi, and Hosho means Dharma voice, and Jishi means compassion warrior. And your teacher gives you that name.
So just quickly for reminding me, what is Dharma relative to karma?
Okay. Dharma is basically the truth of the universe. Colloquially, it can be a teaching. It can stand for the way things are. Buddha Dharma is the teachings of the Buddha. Dharma is any kind of teaching. Karma is the consequences of actions.
So, now, how is your Zen Buddhism? I just wanted to get a baseline. I'm sorry, I'm so ignorant about this. How is your Zen Buddhism different than, saying, studying what Padmasambhava taught or something like that?
Sure, that's a great question, actually. So Buddhism is a world religion, and it started with a young prince in Nepal about 3,000 years ago. And so Zen didn't even exist at that time. And Buddha came up upon an understanding of the way the world was actually put together. And he called it dependent origination, which means that everything is dependent on everything else. And since you and I are both made out of lots of not self elements, we're made out of oxygen, we're made out of water, we're made out of sunlight, we're made out of the labors of pollinating insects, out of the people who planted the cotton, grew it, spun it,
Stardust.
wove it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So because of that, because that's the essential fact of the entire universe, Buddha understood that things are empty of self, that even though we have self-awareness, there's nothing inside of us that corresponds to an organ, which is the germ of our existence. If I ask you to find yourself, you can't find it. It doesn't have a color. It doesn't have a shape. It doesn't have characteristics. It's an awareness. But as we grow up and as we interact with other people, we're told who we are. You're a good boy. You're a nice girl. You're a mean boy. You're a mean girl. Cumulative descriptions arise. And also, we make assumptions on the way people respond to us. If people respond to us, we think, well, oh, I must be this way or that way. And as we get older, that awareness becomes codified into an idea of a fixed entity. And we conceive of that entity as in here and everything else out there. And suddenly we're this very tiny, insignificant speck in the universe. And it's kind of
Mhm.
daunting and overwhelming. And there are various human strategies for compensating. People try to get wealthy, they try to get powerful, they try to get famous, they try to hide their fear. And with that, we also have an evolutionary freight of what Buddha called greed, hatred, or anger, and delusion. And we come into the world with those things, and they obviously stood us in good stead at some point in human or hominid evolution. But in a world with nuclear weapons and billions of people, we really need to learn how to deal with them, or we cause serious problems. And so, one of the consequences of this emptiness, this understanding of emptiness, like if you take an apple apart, there is nothing you will find anywhere in it which stands for the germ of appleness. And if you take a hand apart, you take out the skin, the tendons, the ligament, the bone, the nerves, the blood vessels. There's nothing in there that is hand. It's all made of not hand uh, ingredients. So one of the things that Buddha understood and taught was that as humans, we have the full spectrum of human nature available to us all the time. There's no such thing as good guys and bad guys. You could be Mother Teresa, you could be Eva Braun, I could be Donald Trump, I could be Hitler, I could be Martin Luther King Jr. And once you understand that, then Buddha's mindfulness becomes uh, clarified because you understand that what you're really doing is paying attention when you meditate to what your mind produces and generates and as you go through life realizing if you're not on guard you can let negative capacities and impulses, competition, jealousy, envy can slip out. So we spend our attention knowing how dangerous human beings actually are. And when you think of yourself as the good guys or the good girls, it means that you've vanquished half of human nature and you've just put it beyond examination. It makes you very dangerous because it was the good guys that bombed hotels in Baghdad in the middle of the night, killed men, women, and children in their sleep because our leader didn't like their leader.
And the good guys did Hiroshima.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and it comes from being unexamined and not understanding the full spectrum of humanity that you are. And so if you're only the good guy, it's pretty easy to feel weak and it's pretty easy to feel frightened and threatened by those people you consider the bad guys. So Buddha came and he lived in as ascetic in the jungle for 6 years, and he was so hard on his body. He had this idea that matter and spirit were different, and he wanted matter. He wanted a spiritual, I mean, he wanted spirit, the spiritual awakening. And he starved himself until he passed out one day in a gutter in a country, like a drainage ditch in a country road. And this young girl who was carrying an offering of rice and milk to a temple nearby saw him and spontaneously took pity on him and gave him this rice and milk. And it brought him around. And he was also incredibly moved by the compassion that she showed him. And so he took a vow not to move from his seat until he was enlightened. So, in some indeterminate period after that, he also learned that asceticism was not the right way to go, that starving the body was not the right way to go. And he began to think in terms of a middle path. You have to keep the body healthy to have the mind healthy. So when he had his enlightenment experience, which basically is stepping outside the realm of the self temporarily, you're never going to, the ego's not our enemy. You're never going to destroy it. But when you meditate for long periods of time, when you're really disciplined, the thing we refer to as the self becomes kind of porous and reality kind of seeps in. And at some point, you may or may not lose it for a couple of minutes. And you realize that everything's just the same. It's just you're not there. The trees are there, the birds are there, the world is there, and it's doing just fine. So he thought about it for 49 days. He thought that this was too subtle to teach people. And finally, he decided, well, I'll try. His compassion was such that he thought, I'll try. Maybe I'll help some, I'll lose others. And he came back and he met the disciples that he was studying with. And they were angry at him because they had seen him take the milk and the rice and they thought that was indulgent and he was feeding his ego and one thing and another. But as he approached them, uh, they saw he was different. I mean, he was not famous. He was not Deepak Chopra. He was just a mook they'd been studying with in the jungle. But he was carrying himself very differently. And he came and he gave a very, very short lecture called the Four Noble Truths. And it's worth telling you about him because it's the core of Buddhist understanding and teaching. So usually the Four Noble Truths are translated in English as suffering exists, there's an end of suffering, there's a path to end suffering. It's pretty abstract. And I had the good fortune to meet a Buddhist who's not a Zen Buddhist at all. He's a what's called a Pure Land Buddhist. He lives in England. And he wrote a book. His name's David Brazier. And he wrote a book called The Feeling Buddha. And in this book, he translated the Four Noble Truths in a slightly different way. And for the first time, they were actionable. There were things that you could do. And I completely understood them. And it changed my practice. So I'm gonna tell you what they were because that's my job. So the first noble truth was called dukkha, D-U-K-K-A. And early Christian translators translated it as suffering. But there are problems with that word. It has Christian intonations to it, and it tended to make it sound like a mental event. You know, it's not being ill that's the problem, it's being worried about being ill and fretting about being ill. So he went back to the original Pali, which was the religious language of the day, and Sanskrit. And the word Buddhist used was dukkha. And dukkha means affliction. So the first noble truth of existence is affliction. Everything is afflicted. It's like we live in a world with a peppered wind. We get too cold, we move closer to the fire. We get too hot, we move farther away from the fire. Mountains are worn down by sand. Rabbits are chased by hawks. Everything is under pressure, and it's this affliction which keeps the universe moving, which keeps us moving and changing. And he was very clear in pointing out it's not your fault. You're not afflicted because you're spiritually undeveloped. You're afflicted because it's the essential truth of the universe. And he called it a noble truth. And if truth means anything, it means real. And if noble means anything, it means worthy of dignity and respect. And so what he was trying to say is, this is the nature of reality. We are under affliction. And he defined it in his first speech. He said, dukkha is birth, death, grieving, loss, physical pain. It's being trapped in situations we don't want to be trapped in. It's being withheld from situations we do want to be in. And it's fundamental. So the second noble truth is called samudaya, and it means arising. And it means when you're afflicted, thoughts and feelings and impulses arise. And they're not your fault either. Somebody cuts you off in the car, you get frightened, or you get angry, or you want to flip them the bird. Again, it's just a spontaneous reaction to the affliction. Don't judge yourself. It's a noble truth, but you need to know that it's out there so you can be on guard when they come. The third noble truth is the first one you can do anything about, and it's called nirodha. And nirodha is it's a word that refers to a clay wall built around a fire pit to keep the flames from jumping over into the village or into the fields. And the flames for Buddha were the passions or the impulses and sensations which prompt us to movement before we've considered them. So he's saying there's nothing crazy about feeling anything. That's just the part of the human spectrum. But what you need to learn is that you can contain those feelings. Now, most of us get in trouble when we run away from their feelings. I mean, I was a heroin user for a decade. I had a junkyard dog in my psyche that I couldn't face. And so rather than face it, well, I'd take drugs, I'd wind up in the wrong bed, I'd spend too much, I'd gamble, I'd do any of the things people do, shop too much, overeat. And it all comes from running away. There's nothing dignified about the running away. And Buddha wanted us to live a dignified, helpful life. So what you learn is that by meditating and assuming this absolutely still posture where you vow not to move for a period of time and you don't distract yourself, you just follow your breath and follow your posture, and whatever comes up, you recognize and you admit and you investigate. And by doing that over and over and over again, you build a kind of faith that's based on experience. It's not the faith that once upon a time, an old Jewish guy found a bush on fire and it talked to him. That's something that's unverifiable. We just accept it because we were told it. Or that, Jesus turned water into a glass of wine. Maybe not. I wasn't there. This is a different kind of faith. It's a faith based on experience, that as you meditate, you will see your body will get stronger, your mind will quiet down, it will get calmer, and whatever comes up, you will be able to handle. The Buddha didn't deny that you were real. He just denied that you had a fixed self. And so your self-awareness is one half of the description of the universe, or the experience of the universe. The other half is when you meditate and your mind slows down enough that you can peek around the edges of your ego, or your ego might temporarily disappear, but you can't live there. As long as you have a form, you are stuck in the world of form until you let this body go. But to think that you only have the world of form denies you the possibility of spiritual growth. So the ancient Chinese used to call awareness the host because it's always home. And they used to call the body the guest because it comes and goes. So if the host doesn't know there's a guest, there's no way of experiencing the world. And if the guest doesn't know there's a host, there's no way of achieving spiritual growth. So the two are always together. So when we meditate, we're first of all accepting the body. It's going to hurt. It's going to be a little difficult. Your mind is going to be much busier than you thought you could bear. And the reason that we have a specific form that we hold and we pay attention to our exhales is because by not moving and not honoring these phantasmagorical uh, images of the brain, which is what the brain is a gland that generates images. Everything calms down. It's not like you can control it. It's not like yourself. And by the same token, if you have an image of yourself sitting on a pillow, seeking enlightenment, which is over here, you've already conceived of the two as separate. They're never going to meet. What Buddha pointed out to us was our fundamental nature is enlightened. Our deepest internal self is the same potent void, emptiness, energy of the universe. And we're blocked from seeing it because of negative qualities called kleshas, anger, greed, hatred, delusion. As we see through these things and as they thin and disappear, we become more and more intimate with our true nature, which is the nature of the universe, which is this completely fluid, changeable, impermanent energy that we participate in for a while. So once you've learned to contain all the stuff that comes up, nirodha, the last noble truth is called marga, and this is called the Buddhist path. And this is walking in the world to imitate the life of a Buddha in your own life. And to do this, it's called the Eightfold Path. We have these precepts or these questions we ask ourselves as we're making decisions. Buddhist view, am I looking at things the right way? Buddhist speech, am I speaking kindly and trying to be helpful? Am I showing off and am I self-aggrandizing? Buddhist action, and I'm behaving a way that's going to be helpful to other people. Buddhist livelihood, am I earning my living in a way that does not harm the universe or animals or the other creatures of the earth? Am I making a Buddhist effort, which is total commitment to what you're doing? Am I Buddhist concentration, which means am I keeping my concentration fixed on what my inner state is and what I'm feeling in response to the world, what's arising in me? And finally, Buddhist mindfulness. So when you can do that, then you're dedicating your life at the point at which you have to make any decisions. You go through that little list. You say, oh, well, is this Buddhist speech? Am I speaking the right way? Am I being kind to this person? Am I speaking about myself more than them? Am I praising myself at the expense of others? And this is something that you work out with your deepest intuitions and understanding in an effort to model the life of a Buddha in this world and to live a noble, dignified, helpful life.
What I like about that is that sounds like a wonderful primer for, I mean, let's just digress a second here. Right now, we're in crazy time.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure all stages of world evolution have been in crazy time, but we are so triggered, so angry, so in each other's faces without, I mean, there's a freedom to say bad things, nasty things about people on social media, no holds barred. And it's, we're lit up and revved up and at each other's throats.
Yep.
And here you've just said some very important structure that could you talk about taking those and applying them as we
Sure.
walk our day? Because I mean, it feels like this could calm us all down.
Well, meditating will definitely calm you down because when you sit still, you're denying impulses to the mind. And
Mhm.
the mind starts to relax. You can't slow it down. If you try to stop the mind, it's like using a weight at the gym. It just makes the muscle stronger. But when you just do nothing but just be there, You're just in reality, and you don't care whether you're bored, whether you're interested, whether you're not. You're just surrendering to the universe, and you're keeping your posture erect, and you're paying attention to your breathing, to your exhales. Let your stomach pooch out. That will slow you down, and after about a month, it makes you feel like the inside of your head's expanded, that you're running around a much bigger field. So it's a little like you've taken the lid off the pressure cooker. Some of the steam goes out of it. So as the steam goes out of it, you can become less and less triggered. When you're operating under great pressure, it doesn't take much to set you off. So let's look at some of the pressures that we're operating under.
Mm-hmm.
So we live in a pretty unjust economic system
Mm.
where the game is
The
rigged.
game is rigged.
Yeah, the game is rigged
Mm.
in favor of the greediest people in the culture. And the consequence of that is that many, many people are working too hard. They don't have time for themselves and their families. They don't have time to concentrate, to meditate, or relax. They tend to indulge themselves with drink or drugs or toys or various kinds of indulgences. So, one of the things about Buddhism is for almost 3,000 years, it existed under the authority of a king or an emperor. So there was not a lot of talk about social justice. There was not a lot of talk about changing it. But now, for the first time in the West, Buddhism meets psychology, which Gary Snyder called the West's compassion. And we also meet the social justice movement, and we meet studies of various economic systems. So I'm not saying, for instance, that capitalism is at the root of everything, but I would definitely say that unregulated capitalism causes a lot more trouble than regulated capitalism. I've lived in Italy, I've lived in France, I've lived in England, I've lived in Spain, and these are countries that have been socialist at times. They have rules that protect the people. There's still plenty of rich people, but a certain kind of pressure is off. You're not going to die in the street because you can't afford an emergency room or a doctor. You're not going to wind out without electricity or hot water. There are certain standards. And so one of the things I try to get people to think about is they're all afraid of this word socialism. But what is socialism? Socialism is capitalism with rules. The
Well,
rules.
I live in arguably a very rural, conservative South Central Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And I was
I grew
standing
up
in
in
the post
Pennsylvania.
office. I'm sorry.
I grew up in Pennsylvania near the Delaware Water Gap.
How about that? Up there by Stroudsburg?
Yeah, right next to Stroudsburg, Portland, Pennsylvania.
How about that? I'm along the turnpike halfway between Philly and Pittsburgh.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, I was in the post office and the postal clerk and an older woman were griping about blah, blah, blah. If we elect so and so, we're going to get socialism and the cost of eggs is going to go to $6 a dozen. And I said, hang on a second. Are you on Medicare? Do you receive medical assistance to help you with your medical bills? There are things that the government does for you.
Social Security, the
Social
military,
Security,
the
like,
law.
hang on, hang on, hang on. Oh my golly.
Yeah. Well, let's go back. Let's go to the root of this. So after World War II, when we were having the Nuremberg trials, my family had a friend who was one of the prosecutors of the German industrialists. And just before the trials began, President Truman called him into his office and he said, you have to go soft on the German industrialists because we're going to need them after the war. We're going to be in competition with Russia for world resources and ideology, and we're going to need these guys. So shortly thereafter, the United States took a kind of ham-handed attack. Remember, it used to be legal to be a communist or a socialist. It's just a different political philosophy. There's nothing out of the ordinary. But during the 1950s and the McCarthy period,
Long came McCarthy, yep.
right.
And Roy Cohen, was it? Oh, anyway.
Well, let's, even without the players, we could just say, just a minute, I'm going to turn my phone off because it's going in my ear here. Um, we could just say that a ham-handed attack was made on everything left of the center. And instead of just explaining to people the distinctions between communism and socialism and capitalism, regulated capitalism and unregulated capitalism, which we have, which is called neoliberalism, which is the belief that markets should never be regulated, that they're natural systems which will be corrupted by regulation. The American people were just taught to hate and loathe everything to the left 60 years ago. So they've grown up with this. They have no idea what socialism is. All that socialism is the people decide to keep certain things on a nonprofit basis for themselves. Why does electricity have to make a profit? We all need it. Why does the post office have to make a profit? What about mass transit? What about healthcare? What about old age insurance? Then everything else is left to capitalism. There's room for entrepreneurs. There's room for, people to be rich and not rich, but at least everybody has a floor under them. So if I'm in Paris, I can go into my apartment and for $20, a doctor will come to my house. And if he needs a lab for another $20, a lab will come to my house. So if Spain, Italy, France, England, Germany, if all these countries, which have economies a tenth the size of ours, can give free medical care to their people, can give rent subsidies so that somebody dies and the widow's not thrown out on the street because they no longer have two rents, there's no question that we can't, that we couldn't. But our system is based on money. And from the day that the Supreme Court said that the giving of money to campaigns is free speech, they threw all the advantage to money. And then when they came with Citizens United and they said, oh yes, unlimited money, unlimited anonymous money. So we no longer know who our Congress is beholden to. And just yesterday, the Supreme Court said it was legal to bribe people as long as you give them the bribe after they've done what you wanted them to do, not before. So these are kind of crazy belief systems that don't take the health and well-being of the people into mind, like guns, like weapons of war on the street. There's no other country that has the number of shooting deaths that we do. So, but what's the root of that? The root of that is thinking about self and other, that the other is after what you want. And I think the pressure cooker we're all in right now that's amping up everything is global warming, that everyone's afraid to really think about and consider. Certainly our leaders are not. Our leaders are not making plans to cut down the number of cars on the road. They're not making plans to get rid of the cattle business. They're not making plans to do any of the things we really need to do if we were serious, because the economy is controlled by the oil business, the weapons lobby, the big pharmacological lobbies. So until we as individuals free ourselves a little bit to see it clearly, we're not going to be able to transform it. And we may not be able to transform it, and we may lose it all because nothing may be done about global warming. But that still doesn't mean on a moment-to-moment basis, if you know that those pressures are working on you, you can counteract them. You can be careful with losing your temper. You can still practice speaking kindly. You can understand that it's not anybody's fault, that we're all in this together, and blaming somebody or assigning them the role of evil is just a way of flattering yourself and saying you're the good person. As long as I'm against this, I'm a good person. But you may be using the same electricity, the same gasoline. You may be living in a house that's much bigger than anybody in Guatemala would be living in. You may have a jet ski, a truck, a sailboat. You may take 3 vacations a year. Nobody wants to look at giving anything up. And the reason is because people feel that they are a separate integer, and without all this stuff, they're tiny and insignificant. If they understood that they were actually all of it, you are the entire universe. You've got nothing to gain and nothing to lose, really. You'd at least have a little mental space to begin playing around with looking at the way you live. Suppose everybody
So how?
decided to stop shopping. Just here's one mental exercise. Suppose we
Mhm.
got tired of having our electoral system run by money. If 80% of the people want weapons of war off the streets and nothing happens, it tells you that the Congress is indebted to the 20%. So suppose we wanted full federal funding of elections. Suppose we wanted our Congress to be paid for by us, and we didn't want corporations to give money because they're giving money for their shareholders, not for the people. Well, what could we do? Well, one thing that always interests me is we could all stop shopping. We could all just start cutting back to the minimum that we need, 2 gallons of gas. Don't buy any new clothes. Trade with your friends. Buy used stuff. And once the flow of money began to slow down to the corporate sector, we might have their attention. But what happens is the reverse. People are nervous, they're frightened, so they indulge themselves and they buy too much and they empower the very people that are shipping their jobs overseas or busting their unions, things like this. So meditation makes it easy to see all this clearly. You can see it without being frightened. You can see it without being panicked. And to me, that's the first step, is just looking at the world and start taking the pieces apart and saying, gee, does it really work when we have the same levels of economic disparity that they have in Saudi Arabia? It doesn't seem to. And does it work when a whole bunch of men and 6 unelected people on the Supreme Court are telling women they have to carry babies to term when they may have been raped or they may not be a good time for them to have a baby? I mean, these things are not so confusing because most of the appeals are really about political power. Right now, I just narrated a film called Bad Faith, which is about it's about Christian nationalists. And Christian nationalists are people who pretend to be Christians, and they use kind of very, very conservative right-wing evangelicals and Pentecostals as political foot soldiers. And they're being supported by the oil industry and the Koch brothers, who are giving them super sophisticated computers so that they can go into Michigan and look at the swing counties. And these are bids for power. Jesus never told anybody to do this. So there's a very concerted plan on the part of some very shrewd, very smart, very wealthy people to end our democracy. And they're cloaking their efforts under religious stuff, and they're cloaking their efforts under social taboos like LGBTQ, or introducing their children to ideas, or acknowledging America's racial history. But the name of the game is power. That's what they're after, and that's what they're going to take away from you and me. So we have to find a way to talk about it, as you did. Everybody in America is using the law. Everybody's using the highways. Everybody's using the infrastructure. Computers were designed by the government. The military that protects us is socialism. Social Security is socialism. Medicare is socialism. So we have to find a way to get through these prejudices and taboos and we can only do that when we stop being angry. No one's going to listen to us if we're shouting at them or being rude to them. And so meditation helps us drop the temperature. So we can just say, well, wait a minute.
So other than meditation, we have a few minutes left, maybe 7 minutes left. You wrote Zen in the Vernacular.
Mhm.
What are some things other than meditation that you can tell the listeners that they can participate in or actively do that can help on a day-to-day basis?
Well, one thing is to talk to people who think differently than you. Get together a bunch of people over a glass of wine. There's a group in Chicago called Red, Wine, and Blue. It's run by a woman who started calling housewives together. Trumpers, right-wingers, left-wingers, just women talking and sharing a glass of wine in a safe space. So you have to be able to talk to people. And even though you might not agree, if you keep talking, you start to develop relationships. And those relationships have a certain kind of adhesion to them. You may not convert anybody, but they're going to see that you are a human, that you're not crazy, that you're not greedy. And I found this out. I worked for Jerry Brown when he was governor of California the first two terms. And I was running a state agency, the California State Arts Council. And when I came in, I had really long hair. I was wearing my biker leathers, and I was a man of the people, and I was not going to take any prisoners. I was an artist in a little company. Many of my friends had to go to New York to get recognized and famous and win prizes because we couldn't get any traction at home. And so I came in and I said, well, I don't care about the symphony, the opera, and the ballet. We're going to just do the community arts. And I cast the state in an uproar, and basically it's frozen. The rich people had all the money and power in the Congress, and my people had all the voters. So the governor called me into his office. He said, Pete, in a democracy, all boats rise or all boats sink. You can't play favorites. And as soon as he said it, I thought, oh, yeah, they're all paying taxes. They've all got a right to see their culture expressed. Who am I to say that the opera, the symphony, the ballet shouldn't be there? So we got the governor to put this. When I started, we were $1 million agency. And I got the governor to float a $20 million request to the legislature. I said, you don't have to lift a finger. Just put it in there so we can organize. If we can't win it, we won't. And to make it happen, I had to go around to everybody and apologize. All the people I'd insulted and been rude to, all these conservative legislators, just sat down, let them get to know me. We talked about dogs and hunting and fishing and all sorts of stuff. And the next year, every California agency was held to a 10% cut because Proposition 13 passed and property taxes were cut back to 1% of your value. But my agency went up from $1 to $5 million. And the next it went to 8. And when I left, it was 18 million, including federal money. And in that time, I was saved over and over again by right-wing legislators who ran the Finance Commission, for instance, who had come to trust me and knew that I was doing something and the council was doing something that was serious and well-intentioned. So I've had experience of working with my polar opposites, and by being respectful and polite and friendly and agreeing to disagree, change the nature of intractable political problems.
So we have 3 minutes left. So sitting down and letting yourself be seen and heard by people with whom you don't agree until they start to see you as human, kind of drop that separation. What else in the last 2.5 minutes? What else
Well,
can people do?
remember, that can only happen when you see them,
Correct.
right? As long as they're evil and you're representing good, nothing's going to happen.
Can't be us versus
Yeah.
them.
So that's one thing. The other thing is find somebody that needs help and help them. Stop thinking about your own problems and your own loss. The quickest way to feel better is find somebody that needs something. I'd rather make a sandwich for a homeless person than give a speech about hunger to 10,000 people. Because the sandwich is an activity you can model. You can do it. Everybody can make a sandwich for somebody or take their old socks and give them to people that are homeless. Just get to know these people. So If every neighborhood took care of the people who were in need, you wouldn't have to ask the government to do it. Get to know your police. They're not bad people. There are bad eggs in every business, but they're basically most people who go into public service are going in to try to be helpful. And they don't want to be stereotyped. They don't want to be judged. So, if I'm going on a trip, I might ask the cops to keep an eye on my house or bring them coffee if I see them sitting out there on a long watch. Just something that makes them human, that makes them recognize that you see them as human. And work on erasing the lines between yourself and other people, because the only thing you know about other people is they were made by the universe just like you were. They have equal standing to be here. And the only thing you can really try to find out from them is, why are their experiences leading them to different conclusions than yours? You have no more authority than they do just because you think you're the good guy. So we have to relax all this stuff and start getting to know our citizens, our bureaucracy, people in the post office. There's no law preventing you from sweeping the street in front of your store. There's no law preventing you from being polite or kind. And if you begin to do that and model it, you change the responses of the people who respond to you. And little by little, you make a difference by consistency, by setting that standard for yourself over and over again.
Wonderful. We have to close. So everybody listening, Peter Coyote has been with us and talking to us about ways to model different behavior in the world, and in doing so, change the gaps that we think exist between us. And you can find him on Facebook. He gives teachings. And
well, YouTube.
On YouTube.
I post things on Facebook. I do at the authentic Peter Coyote, because there are other people that use my name.
Okay, good. And then, of course, you can look at his new book, Zen in the Vernacular. And Peter, thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Well, thank you for asking me, Sharon. It was a pleasure.
All right, it was nice talking to you. And Sierra, thank you for behind the scenes. And I'm Doc Martin on Maximum Medicine. Thank you. You've been listening to Maximum Medicine Radio with Doc Martin. Tune in next time while the doc talks health, spirituality, and the impact your beliefs have on every part of who you are, body and soul. Doc Martin unpacks the challenges we face as human beings and teaches callers to open the door between the scientific and the mystical. To learn more about Doc Martin and Maximum Medicine, visit www.sharonmartinmd.com.
The views expressed on this program are those of the host, guests, and callers, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the station, its management, or advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.